All right, welcome back. What did I want to do today? I'm hoping this mic's loud enough. Should be okay. I was just watching my lockdown, part of my lockdown video from God knows how long ago, 2 months into the thing, and I kind of gave a breakdown of some of the things I'd been looking at the time. Tried not to be too invested in any one angle. Um, and I've got another video to do today on British poetry. But before I wanted to do that, I thought I would do a shorter video just on my thoughts, not particularly on lockdown to be honest, but just on what is British culture and world culture um, in the summer of 2020. What are the indications of some form of evolution? I want to paint a bit more of a rosier picture. I kind of went into certain darker elements of how to interpret that lockdown. Uh, Whether you believe or you don't believe in a virus, or you believe in the response being negative or positive, I think there are other things surrounding um, this event, more cultural issues and issues of information. I think this video will be called something like Politics, Information, Emancipation, possibly, because I don't view this thing as supremely negative. I think it's, as I mentioned in that video, I mean, it's horrific for elderly people to be isolated. That's easing down now. But yeah, there's lots of issues there. You've got domestic violence, and you've got people kind of not used to being at home with their families and all the rest of it. I wanted to give more of an overview of how I see what has happened to information over the last 20, 25 years. And I actually want to paint a rosier picture, like I say. Um, I think the one thing you can guarantee with a large number of the British public, I would imagine. Now, I don't go on any one set of stats. I'm not much of a reader of statistics. It's my assumption as an artist or as a creative person looking at what's happening to culture, and I always use that word culture very carefully, because I noticed in the video I said cult and culture within the same sentence, and it didn't really it needs to be teased out a bit more, that, because there's a kind of a negative sense of culture. For example, I don't really believe in the poetry culture in England. That doesn't mean people aren't interested in poetry. It means that I'm very skeptical of any government imposed system of culture. So if I see somebody who's reading in a theatre and I know that they're being sponsored and paid by the Arts Council, um, that might be okay. Um, there might be interesting artists, but they do have funding behind them, and as much as any arts council might want to remain neutral on questions of the arts, they don't really. They're not neutral, and I think dissent, particularly political dissent, is not something that they're interested in. This is a problem with government as it grows, is that you can't really police creativity, because it's just too varied. I mean, there's too many people out there with too many different opinions. The only reason I mentioned that is because I think there is a, so that's kind of the negative take on culture, just as it pertains to the arts. I think there's a positive form of it, which is a lot more to do with classical culture and the way that European cultures are descended from, say, certain high cultures of Greece and possibly the Roman Empire. I'm less keen on ancient Rome than some of the Greek ideas that I've read about. But there is a framework there, and some of it's quite positive. Obviously, Plato was not keen on having the poets in his Republic, but I think history has proved that you can't really keep them out either, just because people always have a sensibility that includes the arts, and even some of the most, say, officially uneducated people will still have an eye on the arts and on writing. And I think they would be in the minority. I think with British culture in the universities becoming more and more abstract and Marxist and liberalist, that's not actually served the humanities and the arts very well, actually, because everything should be in its place. There should be, I would say, a good education system would focus on language acquisition and practical instruction of practical tasks like plumbing and electricity and housing maintenance and economic maintenance, this kind of thing. So it's very nuts and bolts in that sense. And I think that would be culture. We don't really have culture now, to a large degree. But what I'm getting at is that there is a need for poetry. But anybody who's coming up with anything massively new is always going to meet massive resistance. That's not even to do with the way that government oversees the arts. It's just it's an energetic principle, I would imagine. Now, why am I talking about all this? I think I'm trying to get at something about the way that we have received information, the way that we receive information differently now than we did 20 years ago. I include the arts because what you see now is national councils, you know, accepting certain forms of writing and assuming that other forms of writing are not within their remit for whatever reasons. And often these choices are entirely unconscious. But spiritual evolution to me demands that councils shrink, and as with local businesses, poets and artists are supported on an extremely local level and an extremely international level, in the sense that we now have the internet. We have two forms of what I would call useful community. We have a local community with outreach to central government, possibly, depending on what you require of them. And then we have this much more hazy but incredibly useful resource that we know as the internet. What do the events of the last few months tell us when we're talking about cultures? Well, first of all, conspiracy theory or otherwise, as I said in the last video on the lockdown, people can break down information a hell of a lot faster now, particularly sanctioned major media information. when I look back, I'm fascinated by the different events that have happened internationally and nationally over the last 20 years, because it seems to me that we are. I'm not particularly interested in this notion of ascension. Perhaps I am a believer in that in some way, but I'm definitely a believer in spiritual evolution. And as much as you'll find me very dismissive of, say, the last century in writing, um, that might always be the way because of this natural resistance people have to the new. But underneath all of that, I do see some form of progression. It's not the liberal progress that we're told about, and it's not to come out of the mouths of people who profess to be progressive politically. It's something else. It's something very ethereal. Um, I think I'll get more into personal story again, because I think anecdotal stuff is interesting when you're analysing culture. And I think actually our generation is quite lucky. I mean, I'm 43, right? So I spent probably almost a decade, the first decade of my adult life in a non-internet world. So we're lucky in the sense that we can really analyze the effect of the internet pre and post. Now, it's a tricky subject because obviously the big innovative voices of the 90s, I might use somebody like Terence McKenna as an example, were obviously exploiting the internet quite early. I mean, by the mid-90s, you get the impression that somebody like that has got their hands on the internet and they are trying to relay information to people. I think that was a real slow burn to begin with, to be quite honest, and it was only involving a small number of people. Say, for example, you take the response to the link between COVID-19 and what is it, 5G. Whether you believe in it or don't believe in it is not the question. What is fascinating is within a week of a certain number of presentations being uploaded onto YouTube, people were responding by setting things alight. Now that's interesting. It's not, like I said in the other video, it's not something that I would recommend. I don't think it's very sensible to do that. But what's interesting about it is that the effect of the internet, the fact that everybody is tapped into this thing, means that it's a very different world. I mean, even the response to mobilize people against COVID within weeks, I would say that's a kind of a mistaken mobilization. But again, it's very interesting. You couldn't mobilize anybody in the 90s. It would have taken months to get everybody under the one umbrella and say, oh yeah, this shit's going on, and you better be careful and all the rest of it. So now you can read that as wholly negative, and there have been, real negative readings of technology. But I think actually, in all honesty, technology is just a neutral force. I mean, that's a form of technology. We don't rail about pens anymore. So there's that Marshall McLuhan element, is that you're immersed in a culture that's already taken on board a certain amount of technology, and you just don't know actually what you're in. And you may be fearful, you may be hopeful, depends on your mood from day to day. Another example, 9/11. Now, I was actually in Japan when 9/11 happened. I don't want to get too into my own history, but I'll just give you a quick story on that. I, like everybody my age, or if you were younger and you saw this event, you see it on the television, and the internet really didn't kick in till a little bit later, at least for me personally. So that what you had was a bunch of television media reports coming out of the major news networks, and I was working as an English language teacher in Osaka, Japan at the time. And so you have a conversation, a rather emotional conversation with people. You've got North Americans and Japanese all working together. And obviously, the next couple of days and the following weeks, there's a certain amount of anxiety about what's happening in the news. But you're still pretty much plugged into, at least if you speak English, you've got a handful of major stations in the US that you might be aware of. You would, in fact, if you're in Japan like me, you might be more aware of them than you would be as an average Brit at that time, to be honest. And then at that time in Britain, what would you have had? You would have had, what is it? I think it was 5 channels by then that would be pumping out this information. Now, again, the conspiracy angle I'm going to leave to another video, perhaps a longer video. I've looked at so many theories about that event now that I've lost count, and there's still people trying to figure out what happened. And I had periods where I was very fixed on one version of what was going on. But my point here is to say that I didn't know. I mean, maybe I was a slow learner, but I didn't really have any questions about 9/11 really until 2006, because I remember specifically watching the loose change video, and that was quite effective in having people enter an arena where massive questions were raised. I'm sure other people of my age will have seen that video by now. But that was 2006, okay? So we've got an event from 2001 being broken down, and obviously it came into circulation possibly a couple of years before I saw it, probably. I'm not sure. I'd have to check. But okay, so, and of course those closest to the event would have started being curious the quickest, I would imagine. So you would have people in the US trying to figure out what the hell went on. But anyway, the point stands. 5 years it took me personally. I would imagine myself to be, whether I am or not, I don't know, a pretty curious person, intellectually, emotionally curious in what's going on in my own country and around the world. I'm not a genius at figuring out this stuff, and in fact, sometimes the one conclusion from all of this research that comes out of the internet is that it's pretty baffling. The mainstream media baffles for different reasons because it's so vapid and one-sided, and then the alternate media baffles because of the absolutely massively varied accounts of events that happen. I would opt for the second bafflement, and that may well be one theme of this video. Obviously, you can't take on too much information. I think the point I made about the Brian Rose video was you've got to partake in this thing. I mean, if you're so inclined and you have a video and a camera like I do now. I've been watching the way that alternate media has developed, specifically over the last decade, I would say, pretty, with quite a large amount of effort. I mean, I don't spend as much time on the internet now as I possibly did somewhere between 2010 and 15. I mean, for me, this could just be a generational thing. That was a period of growth for me in, accessing new forms of information, checking out lots of videos, being introduced to a vast array of new writers who were not within that cultural remit I mentioned earlier. So it was all good fun, and but at some point you do have to kind of lend a hand. You have to, and this has been said many times probably, you have to put your views across. But my point is that for a vaguely curious Brit in his early, late 20s to early 30s, it still took me 5 years to break down an event so that I had lots of questions in my mind, and possibly 10 to 15 authors and even more people on the internet who were contributing to different opinions on that one event. And I would imagine from a lot of the videos that I've looked at on YouTube that it was quite similar for a fair chunk of other people my age. Now, there are always going to be people who don't want to access a wide variety of opinions, and that's another theme. So that as much as technology advances, it doesn't mean that people are that interested in it in the main. And you go on social media and people still posting crap about their pets and stuff. That's all good evidence that those people are quite happy to access things that are going on with them immediately and not curious. That's always been the way, technology or no, internet or no. I'm not actually interested in those people, not because I dismiss them entirely, but because it just seems to be a theme of life. What the message I want to give with this talk is that don't focus on those people. They're always going to be there. They are followers. They can follow Tony Blair, or they can possibly follow you if you make a video. It's not guaranteed, but that's the way it works. And then to get even more extreme, there are vast numbers of people putting out alternative research on YouTube who are a softer, less concise version of what I deem myself to be, if anything. And they're acceptable, and possibly the inquiring 10 to 20, 30% of internet viewers might be interested in them, even if I have problems with them. A good example might be Jordan Peterson. I'm very grateful for his existence. I still think it's a bit... it's not that penetrative intellectually for me. The problem with that generation is that they've the conspiracy angle, and I'm not saying you embrace all conspiracies, but the modus of looking into certain conspiracies is not really with that generation of people in the main, and that has good and bad points to it. Somebody like Peterson is a solid public intellectual with useful views, perceiving very definite problems in society and attempting to solve them. And if you watch his videos, then I think they're good for you. And if somebody came to me, particularly if they were young and male, I would definitely send them to Jordan Peterson, because he's a good entry-level guy. Anyway, that's as maybe. My point is that we really are breaking down a lot of these public events a hell of a lot faster than we used to be. We can react badly or we can react well to the information we're given. We shouldn't be riding a wave of theory from day to day so that one day we're up and the next day we're down. I think that is very deleterious of your own psyche after a while, and of course social media doesn't really help that. But watch carefully. Since the beginning of the 90s to 2020 is such a vast leap in the consciousness of people in general, it's sometimes hard to take stock of it all. When I was a student in the mid to late 90s, we had a public library in a town, and hopefully if we bumped into the right kinds of people, we could have a chat over a pint and find out something interesting and learn something. Hopefully we had one or two, three people in our social circle who read, and not just read popular novels, but really read. And I've always been lucky enough to have one or two of those people dotted around. Not a lot. I think, again, don't, I think percentage wise, well, walk into your auntie or uncle's house or something. I'm trying to give you a very direct example, anecdotal example. Look at the bookshelves. What information are they accessing? The mass of people, unfortunately, will live and die and not know very much about what's going on, and not know much particularly about why they're here. That's all well and good, you know. And they'll be wonderful people. They'll be very kind. They'll help you out. They might even help you out financially. They'll support you emotionally. They'll have nice, invigorating conversations on, you know, on the level of perhaps local politics or newspaper stories or something. And maybe they've got some insight even on that level. But don't assume that you're going to get too much from that. And the leap that happened somewhere between 95 and 2005 was that the vast array of information that was now being transferred digitally was kind of changing everything. I mean, it changes the psyche so much that all architectural arrangements of towns and cities and whole countries will evolve positively or negatively because of people's concerns. You go into the average library now and it's shit, to be honest. The books are shit. Now, why are the books shit? Why are the books shit now? And they weren't shit in a library 25 years ago. It's because the stupid people have always stayed around and read rubbish, and the people who want the interesting information aren't going to the library and don't have the need for that, those books from that place. They're getting their information elsewhere. Now, that's no reason to shut down libraries necessarily. In fact, the one thing I get pissed off about as a book collector is that when I order books through a books or some online seller, I would say a good quarter of them are ex-stock from libraries. So that what that means is, and I'm assuming that my taste in books is vaguely good. I don't know if it is. That's very subjective. But what it means is they're not having people read those books, so they might as well sell them off to people. So the stupid people get what they want, and also stupid people, that's an overgeneralization. People go to libraries. The people that go to libraries now are a totally different crowd than those that went to libraries in the 90s. Perhaps elderly people who don't use the internet very much. Younger people who've been told by their school to go because it will help them in some project. libraries are becoming more community oriented, I think. So people will be coming in not necessarily to read, but they'll be coming in to check out certain events. I mean, I'm just speaking about what I've seen locally in Lancashire. Was that a vast tangent? I don't know. But again, this emphasis on uh, receiving information, the way we receive it. Also, the other problem was in Britain, you had a kind of sequestration of knowledge. You've always kind of had this, whether it's conspiratorial, the Vatican Library, or whether it's the fact that you have to pay 20 quid to have access to a university library, because their books are a hell of a lot better than the local library's books. There's always that sense whereby you have to kind of make the effort. It's not a bad thing necessarily. I wouldn't want it to be paid, but there you go. I'd like I'd like to have the idea that you can access a massive wide variety of books without any payment, so that anyone on any level of income can access them. But the truth is that I guess that is naive, because most people are not interested in books that will truly advance them. But even on a lower level, people who read a popular novel, they will still believe that that novel is advancing them. Perhaps it is to a small degree. I don't know. Okay, I'm weaving in and out here. Labyrinthine. So, we go from 95 to 2005. I would say, from my own experience, and it will be obviously different for people who are younger than me, definitely, and older. I'll get into that. 2005, the internet was there. It was established then. A bit of backtrack again. If I get into how I started on the internet, I went to India in 1999. I just left university and I got a Hotmail account while I was traveling. I didn't even get it because I was hip to the internet and wanted to chat to large numbers of people. I just got it because it might be convenient. Instead of letter writing, you would meet other travellers and you would have a way of speaking to them without them having to have an address. So it was practical on that level. I would guess most people kind of my age would have picked up on that and would have had an email account, particularly by the turn of the century, I would imagine. But again, vast change really. Say 99 to 2005, I would say, as a force for good or ill, particularly in terms of video presentations. By 2005, you were up and running. You had a fairly wide variety of information you could access, compared to simply 6, 7 years prior to that. And ever since then, I would say change, vast change, is inevitable. If I get more into conspiracy stuff, I'll talk about that. But I would say, just briefly, that whole arena was available to me somewhere between 2005 and 10. I would say I was not really invested in it till about 2010. In fact, I was a bit of a pawn of people like Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth for a couple of years, and I was interested in ecology and climate change and all of that malarkey. And I've admitted since to people that I was mistaken. Most people don't talk to you about the evolution of your intellectual life, but if it comes up, I'll say fair cop. I didn't really get what was going on there. That's an interesting story in itself, because I was working as a journalist in Korea, a volunteer journalist, and when I actually looked at who was funding the whole climate change thing, I'd before that been writing articles that were pro global warming, and then when I shifted my focus to the economic angle and carbon emissions and this kind of stuff, the people in my NGO Asian English language newspaper were not taking too kindly to Andrew's new information. So I didn't last long in that job. I've never done any paid journalism, and I don't really want to be honest. But again, it tells you something. There's a shift in terms of information. What was that? That actually the video Inconvenient Truth came out in 2007, if I remember rightly. And in the wake of that, you had a vast raft of scholars from Cambridge and Oxford, and the British mainstream newspapers bolstering this stuff, which was heinous and useless to people. And actually, in the long run, I started saying to people that I thought climate change was kind of a replacement for the Old Testament God. You know, we'd stopped believing in God and investing in the Bible, at least in Britain. And we were looking for replacements because we still kind of had this sense of guilt, like I'm not doing something correctly. And then somebody comes in and goes, here, feel bad about yourself, carbon emissions. So there's a emotional involvement there. But as I say, I was also looking into the money. Anyway, again, you can break down that narrative within 3 years of me being very intrigued by that and thinking carbon emissions were terrible and you know, wagging fingers at people. Within 3 years, you've got something else come in which colours that whole move differently. And so there is a kind of an evolution here. What is my end point with this? It's not so much the lockdown, it's not so much the virus, it's the response to the problem, which is interesting, and it's actually really good. What's happening, and has been happening, and I think a lot of people are aware of this already, is that the mainstream media are losing control of the attention, of the psyche, of populations. I don't think it even matters if you dig into conspiracy. I think it just matters that you're vaguely intelligent. You don't have to be what I said is like, what would it be, the 2 or 3% who are producing whatever's very new and destroying paradigms. You don't even have to be in that little group. I would say somewhere between 30 to 50% of any given population are now investing heavily in something else. I would say, depending on the age group, you could even throw those percentages up even more. The people that are left behind are the people who are always left behind in terms of knowing what's going on a macrocosmic level. The people who are the oldest, because you tend to become less inquiring as you get older, and more fearful about your mortality, and you're less curious. Not everybody, but a large portion of them. Similarly, the young, because they have no experience, they tend to be told what to do. Again, not all. There's some really good young people. So those are the two brackets. In the middle, it's even more confusing because you've got people who have enough life experience to be vaguely critical, but maybe they've got issues. They've got pet projects and subjects they like to talk about which are utterly fallacious and don't need to be investigated. We've all got those. You've got to have a bit of humility. I mean, I've probably got a few pet topics of conversation that people just go, it's a bit ludicrous. But then again, that's life, isn't it? Deal with it, you know. Again, that would be the problem with the social media stuff, isn't it? Is that, particularly with younger people, is that they've not got used to the idea that we're all just a variety of people. And take what you need from anybody. You know, it's the old cliches come out, you know. Take what you need. Maybe if you're talking to a guy in the pub and he's a bit of a prick, but you know he's got some great information about such and such, or he's looked into I don't know, Irish history from the 40s and 50s, or somebody knows something about healthcare that you don't, or whatever. There's always bits to pick up. and I hate to use the word democratization because I'm always a bit skeptical of democracy, to be honest. The notion that the 51% of the people are right. I'm kind of for both. I believe in that kind of hero leader archetype who's ahead of the ball game and leads society, whether they like it or not, to some degree. I kind of like that. Who's the guy? Robert Carlyle, not Thomas Carlyle, the writer. You should read a book called On Heroes and Hero Worship. It's not a popular book, and I don't promote popular books most of the time. But that's interesting. It's the great man theory, right? That there are people who just rise up in every generation and come up with something very interesting and new. And that works for people who are problematic and dangerous as well. And I'm sure even the classical liberals who are watching this, or people of any political stripe, would probably flag up somebody like Mussolini or somebody like Hitler as examples of that. I don't have a dog in that race necessarily, but the great man theory is interesting, and the democracy theory, the populism notion, is interesting. I think we should look at these things and not we should always choose both rather than either or, if you know what I mean. We've got to be very nuanced in the way that we look at politics and we look at culture. And I think the last decade, even though we have this vast expansion of information, we still have a certain dogmatism as well, so that we tend to be either or people. We kind of go, I'm an ethno-state person, or I'm a conservative centrist, or I'm a this. That's kind of identity politics. See, that was one of the problems I had with certain political movements of the last 10 years, is that identity politics really only covers for politics. And if you're a poet, identity is not, you're kind of in flux. It's like Heraclitus, your personality is perpetually in some form of spiritual development. So perhaps identity politics is useful on a very limited level to deal with people in terms of groups, but I'd say the vast numbers of people on the earth behave outside of group norms. They violate group norms, and sometimes they want to be in a group and sometimes they don't. And the most creative people would be closer to that great man or great woman even notion, which is, being highly skeptical and not taking any group as a template for your identity, sexual, political, cultural, whatever. Anyway, I'm jumping around here a lot, but what I'm trying to suggest ultimately is that the reason these people are screaming their asses off, be afraid, be very afraid, is because they've lost the ball now. They don't have the attention. I think the attention of man in the mass, what man in the mass attends to psychologically and emotionally, it's a fascinating phenomenon. What's it all about? What am I all about? What do I deal with on a daily basis? What choices am I making in a very local psychological sense? The assumption would be that mass man, if he is in the mass, you would be talking about the collection of those very small decisions that we make from day to day, choices that we make, opinions that we listen to, opinions that we don't listen to, people we talk to, people we don't talk to, what we buy, what we don't buy, what we sell, what we don't sell. That's very old, very old. And they are screaming because the mass attention has moved away from them. And if it wasn't neo-Marxism, it would be something else. The point is that they don't have your attention. You know, it's like it could be in the way that a parent raises a child, and then the child has a, you know, grows up, has a boyfriend or girlfriend that brings them new information, or you have a friend in your late teens or early 20s who tells you stuff that your mum and dad would never have even conceived of. It's fascinating stuff. Um, what does it all mean? Well, it does mean that we can respond in whatever way we choose. Um, let's see how the years roll by. I think I have, I spend a large amount of my time thinking that it will all be quite fine. And I will go into other areas where I would raise warnings. For example, I think I mentioned in my Tsvetaeva video that um, I wanted to do a general Russian poetry video, and that I think that would probably include the memoirs of Nadezhda Mandelstam, who lived through the Soviet Union. Now, Jordan Peterson always talks about the Gulag Archipelago, which is a laudable thing to read. I've looked into it, but I've not read it. Nadezhda Mandelstam is a brilliant, interesting writer, and I'll talk about that more in that Russian poetry video, or Russian literature. The point is that yes, I do have certain more alarmist tendencies, and I can see the warnings from what I've read down through the decades, going back through the last century at least. And there are big problems that we need to worry about. But I do think the news is positive. You know, I'm a big fan of Morrissey. What was it? What's that song that says, in the end when all is well, or something like that? The reason we're focused on apocalypse is because we assume that we want an ending. We think in stories, and we want a happy ending or a sad ending, but we need an ending. We're more ending focused than process focused a lot of the time. So, you know, biblical prophecy is a big one on that. I'm actually a certain fan of prophecy in some ways, but I can understand that endings are very clear and reassuring. Problematic though they are. What if I suggest to you, furthermore, that it will all be okay? That man is a form of consciousness in evolution constantly, and that he decides to measure good and bad as he goes along. And what happens if he chooses badly? Well, you get something like the Soviet Union or Communist China, or possibly Nazi Germany. That's the other problem that we've had. I'm sure many people have said, you know, in terms of numbers, we should be worried much more about communism than Nazism, to be honest. And of course, Hitler is the biggest bogeyman, and the reason he's the biggest bogeyman, not that I agree with the fella very much, although I have read Mein Kampf, not like most critics of Hitler, is because we're kind, like I said in the other video, we're more far left now. That's all. It's just a choice of party politics. Although what we've got as a measure to that, as a response to it, is old conservatism, you know, as a real, not old conservatism, a renewed conservatism that isn't particularly partisan, particularly in the US and not so much in Europe. Well, we do have nationalist movements, but my point again is that man measures good and evil and finds ways of restructuring communal life to his advantage or disadvantage. So you take the super highs and the super lows, right? What happens if you imagine the total worst? I would say 1930s Soviet Union. It's not fun, is it? At all. What about 40s, 50s, 60s China? That sounds like a nightmare to me. So, where am I going with this? Yeah, take the extreme worst, right? And take it down to just you, right? As an individual. It's just you, your own choices. What do you fear the most? Now, the answer to that, and I've been doing some thinking on this, you fear death the most. And if you see a society which seems to be producing a lot of dead people before their time, for whatever ideological reasons, you want to steer clear of that. I guess we would call it authoritarianism to some degree. What, and I'm going to get all mystical on you now, what if you live your life believing that death doesn't exist, that you are an immortal being, and that you don't fear death on a daily basis at all? Maybe you're human enough to, have the odd worry. You want to dodge a car if it comes near you, right? At any kind of speed. But essentially, you are a consciousness that is evolved beyond what we've known 100 years ago. This is probably material for another video, but reincarnation as a fact, not as an emotional investment. You're in the here and now. You've got to get shit done. You can't be going, oh, I'm going to reincarnate, so I'll just, spend 30 years having a few beers and do very little. But as a fact, reincarnation, I'm a big mythology buff. The Irish Tuatha de Danaan, the Irish gods of the old times. What was it again? They had a massive battle with the what's the word? The other mob. Anyway, there was two big enemies in ancient Ireland. Somebody can correct me. It's not the Milesians. The Milesians come in later, and that's more of a kind of racial angle on the thing. The pure mythology is that this group of people came into Ireland. The Tuatha were there, and they said, we want to take over. And the god said, no, bugger off. And they said, well, we ain't going to bugger off. He said, well, you better do, otherwise you're in for a fight. And what's more, we'll arm you. You want to fight? You want to take over the land? Okay. We'll arm you, and then we'll kill you all. Which is what they did. What's the point there? No fear. No fear whatsoever. Man is indestructible. And the only thing that is causing any problems for anyone is him not realizing that. Once you realize that, all problems become rather small in your eyes. I'm not saying I've got it all figured out, but I don't really bother with a lot of this panic. I get caught up in it now and again. I like nuance in everything. And people who are still saying the same things 3, 4 years ago, saying the same things now, I don't pay that much attention. I like it when somebody who's a public intellectual changes their views over time and adds in new information. Um, that's very rare. You've got to be very receptive to the now and how you feel now, and be able to reflect on how you felt then and see the difference, see what the difference is, and have the eloquence to comment on it. That's good, particularly if you're a public intellectual. The other problem that we have is that this, includes the internet stuff, is that you become a one-trick pony, you see, if you get a bit of fame. So you tend to talk on a particular topic, and then of course you're saying something interesting and useful, so then people get interested in it, and then you can end up spending 5, 10 years of your life basically talking on that one safe topic. And perhaps in the meantime you've got all this other information that you've been accessing because you're a vaguely intelligent human being, but you can't actually put that out because you don't want to be seen by your audience as divergent somehow. I'm sure this is why a lot of people don't want to get recognition or gain recognition as well. I mean, I've had periods when I've thought that. It doesn't bother me so much these days, either way, recognition or otherwise. But that's another point, isn't it? You don't want to get cornered into being a one-trick pony. And that can work for any discipline, whether it be in the arts or philosophy or culture or politics. Anyway, have I rambled on enough? I guess my overall point is that, particularly if you're listening to me and you're, say, 25, or you're a mystified 20-year-old who doesn't know what all this internet badinage is all about, and you're still, because when you're young, you've got lots of energy and you've got lots of curiosity, and you'll grab hold of a theory, and it might be the wrong one for a while, and you'll kind of shout about that for a while. And I've done that. We've all done that. It's probably useful in some sense. And the more you shout about it, the more opposition you receive, and then the more opposition you receive, the more chance you have to kind of dig into the problem further. Man regulates himself, I think, as long as government doesn't get too big. It's good. There should be resistance. If you just developed an idea, wrote a couple of books, and everybody just went, wow, I agree with everything you say, or this notion that we're all similar and we all think the same, you get mass audiences for some things, but then hold on, you're processing spiritually as well. So how does that work? That means that you're going to piss somebody off at some point. You'll probably piss me off, maybe. Oh, I'll piss you off, but let's piss each other off together. Do you know what I mean? It helps in the long term. Not to the level of bloody daily anxiety. Do you know what I mean? I think I've already talked about that enough. But, as and when you feel. If you feel a little bit overconfident in one area of your life and you need more input from a certain area of the internet or otherwise, then you go to that person, don't you? That's good stuff. Long pause. I'm trying to come up with a really neat ending to this talk. It's not going to happen. All I'll say is that be aware that this world is in constant change, and it's really interesting, and there are lots of different people in it. And I'd like to say to you that travel helps, but it doesn't always help. If you're a nitwit, you'll always be a nitwit. But there's lots of different people with different ideas and lots of different cultures with different assumptions about the necessary and the unnecessary, the good and the bad. And don't get too worried about one government notion or another. At the end of the day, most things don't last. Most people who are big now will be gone. You only have to look at history. I always find it fascinating when I study poetry, you know. Good example, P.B. Shelley, the Romantic poet, right? In his world, Castlereagh, the governor of England at the time, was an evil, horrible man. Who's ever heard of Castlereagh now, apart from his name being on a few streets? Do his ideas have any truck with anyone? We don't know, because most people don't give a shit. And that's the way it should be. I mean, you can look into that corner of history if you want. But my point is that most people who are significant within a number of decades or even one decade will be gone. People are reading Shelley now and will go on reading Shelley for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So, be wary of the shouters and the screamers. We all know that people who raise their voices the loudest have the least amount of substance about what they're saying. The quiet corners are the places to inhabit. Talk to the dark horses, people who are reticent about giving their opinions. You might find their opinions are more nuanced and intelligent than vast rafts of people. So that's worth being aware of. And read Marshall McLuhan. I'm not sure there's much to say. I think possibly, if I'm going to be very positive, and this will have to go into another video more on politics, I do think there's do I want to get into politics? Let's put it this way, there are massive problems in Britain, and we've got to change a lot of things. We've got to have different emphases on different issues. We do need to bring the political framework back to the centre of, say, at least 50 years ago, so that we have a genuine conservatism and a genuine liberalism, I would say. That's a good start. And there are topics that are coming up, whether you're right wing or otherwise. Immigration is going to be a massive one. I'll get into that in another video. But I don't know. I'm in a positive mood. I think that we can self-regulate with the internet, and we can break things down very quickly. And information is neutral. What you do with it is your own choice, and that's your own personal emancipation from any of the uglier aspects of society. So bear that in mind, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.